Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 244, The Little Bighorn. Last week, we continued our unit series with a history of the 14th Brooklyn. This unit always has a fascination for me, obviously drawn in by their uniforms. This week, we have a little bit of a change of pace. We will talk about the famous end to a prominent figure in our narrative episodes, as this week, I would like to talk about the Little Bighorn. Before we do that, though, we do have a little bit of a show announcement. So you'll notice that in this last week, we did not have one of our mini episodes, one of our sub episodes, and the reason for that is that we're switching up the format just a little bit moving forward. And I know I talked about this when we finished season 1, when we finished the narrative episodes and decided to go into this season 2 kind of setup. We've gone to the bi-weekly, a little bit of a longer episode, and then done these mini episodes kind of in between. And I mentioned when we did this switch that we would maybe dial back those mini episodes and still keep the main episodes bi-weekly. But if you look at the schedule, we've gone through a year now, which is great. A year now since we've done this season 2. And we have done pretty much a mini episode every single week. So we've done still kind of the same schedule as we did during the narrative. But I think having done a year of that, I think the time has come to dial back just a little bit. And so we will be doing the mini episodes just a little bit less. And I think that that is a good thing, because then we'll be able to spend a little bit more time with them. We'll be able to combine topics and make them a little bit longer, I think. And then, of course, we'll still keep these bi-weekly episodes, and they'll be a little bit longer. And I think they are still going to be of the same, quality. And so we'll be able to kind of continue moving forward with that. So just a little bit of an announcement. So if you don't see something every single week, we're still going to have these bi-weekly episodes, and then occasionally we'll still have episodes in between. So just wanted to have a quick announcement for that. I think it is always sort of fascinating that there was, and maybe still is, this interest in George Armstrong Custer and his last battle of the Little Bighorn. I can remember as a kid watching several different versions of the same story in movies, whether it's They Die With Their Boots On or Custer of the West, amongst others. Indeed, I can remember getting a plastic toy soldier playset with Custer and his dismounted cavalry, complete with teepees and mounted Sioux warriors to encircle them. That is the image that we see the most in terms of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, a plains situation with Custer and his men using dead horses for cover as the mounted tribesmen are riding around them, and there are big clouds of dust. It is partly that image which leads me to this episode, and with it, the admittance of something to you all. That is, I sometimes cover topics, or more heavily covered topics, that I would like to freshen up on or dive deeper into. I could do that on my own, but I do think it's also fun to do that in this kind of setup. In that way, it's kind of like a book report that I get to throw into the podcast and then roll out to everyone listening. So it's been a while since I've brushed up on the topic, and I would like to update myself with some new source material as well, which might also be of some interest to you all, maybe taking away that classic image of the circled and the mounted Sioux against the dwindling numbers of 7th Cavalry. I must also add that as a younger man, I went to the Little Bighorn battlefield. The location truly lives up to the hype, as it is usually on the list for not only the best battlefield in America, but also for one of the best battlefields in the world. I cannot recommend it enough to head there, albeit I know it is in more of a remote location. But that is also the appeal in that the field is still relatively in the same condition that it was back in the 1800s. There are markers on Last Stand Hill for the fallen troopers, including Custer, another unique feature. Recent additions also include locations for fallen native warriors as well. Lastly, though, I think if we return to the realm of our narrative, we had an interesting figure in George Armstrong Custer. A name that is more infamous for the subject we are going through today. In the Civil War, he saw a meteoric rise. From staff officer to cavalry leader, one of the famous boy generals. Despite maybe getting more credit than he should have at East Cavalry Field during the Battle of Gettysburg, we cannot downplay his bravery during that engagement. His troopers, especially when armed with their repeating carbines, will turn the tide at many battles. He has a memorable charge at 3rd Winchester and then again at Cedar Creek, his command being involved in the famous counterattack. So he is very much ingrained into our story, and by itself, he had an impressive career during the Civil War. So I think that it is only right that given that, as well as the famous nature of his final campaign, we officially close the book on Custer. That is also very unique to George Armstrong Custer in that we have a lot of these generals who, if they survive the war, they don't have the same kind of ending that Custer has. There is no great war, at least not in the European sense, that is fought in America or an American war against a European power that these officers are going to then be able to be thrown into. And so Custer is kind of unique in that sense that he is going to see this combat, and then he is going to be probably the most famous fatality in the Plains War, of course. Certainly at the time he was pretty famous. 23 years old, he's a general. He had a lot of accolades from the Civil War, and so he's continued to kind of ride that into the 1870s. In our story, too, we have the inklings of the kind of problems that Custer is going to run into that are going to eventually lead to his demise. Notably, we should consider the Battle of Trevilian Station, another situation where Custer will find himself in the rear of the enemy, surrounded, and this is because he was acting aggressively and probably more keen on the glory that could potentially be accrued. While he is able to extradite himself on that day, we will see a different story on the banks of the Little Bighorn. We should also note that this story is a story about the Lakota, Arapaho, and Cheyenne warriors and people who were opposing Custer. I've often said we needed to have an overall view of the war on the plains. The Lakota, which are the primary tribe of the Little Bighorn, have appeared in our story before, being close traditional allies of the Nakota and Dakota. Remember, a big difference is that while the Dakota have some sort of dependency on agriculture, the Lakota are going to be dependent on buffalo for survival. In the early days, they would use dogs to transport their teepees as they followed the herds. The introduction of the horse would be very important, many lodges having to be size enough to house people and young horses to get them accustomed to their riders. Often, the Sioux would be at odds with the Blackfeet, Crow, and Shoshone, the latter two making up many scouts against them in the Sioux War. War was in many ways inevitable, as we have highlighted in our narrative episodes. Remember, we had the punitive expeditions by Sully against the tribe's post-Dakota uprising. In 1868, we have the Fort Laramie Treaty, which would set aside land for the Lakota, included in the Great Sioux Reservation, the Black Hills, a sacred area for the tribe. But in the 1870s, the encroachment of white settlers into this area is going to lead to conflict. A delegation would be sent to Washington, including the Chief Red Cloud, to try to get President Grant to honor the terms of the treaty. But this would be refused, and the intention was given to pay $25,000 for the land and then relocate the Sioux reservations in Oklahoma. Prior to this, there had been another offer for purchase for the Black Hills, as timber was valuable, and the addition of the finding of gold would only see that value of the land increase. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, two leaders amongst the Lakota, would ponder what to do, as many would refuse to meet the relocation deadline. Encroachment into the Crow Reservation would spark what is known as the Great Sioux War. Now, specific to our story, the location of the Little Bighorn encampments was a usual gathering place for the Lakota with plenty of grazing area, which was important for horses. In 1876, it's going to be a particularly large encampment with many leaders, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse included, wanting to figure out exactly what to do about the encroachment by settlers and the U.S. military. The structure of the Sioux and Northern Cheyenne was such that individuals would freely follow leaders, both civil and military. Sometimes these roles overlapped, but sometimes they did not. For instance, the famous leader Crazy Horse was strictly a military leader. If you were a warrior, you could follow a leader and also join a society for purposes of conflict, sometimes multiple. These warrior societies would have different roles in combat and would be formed out of different groups, Crazy Horse famously finding a group that would be for those who lost family in combat, the Kit Foxes being a famous Sioux band. The Cheyenne had the Dog Soldiers, who were vehemently against westward expansion of white settlers. While there was really no organization on the battlefield, there were these societies which would have some order to the way the Sioux waged war. Oftentimes, the tactic was to draw the enemy in with small groups and then ambush, this having been the case at the Fetterman Fight or Fetterman Massacre. This was an engagement in 1866 during Red Cloud's War, which had concluded prior to the expedition we will discuss today. From an early age, the Lakota would be geared for warfare, having an advantage on their counterparts in the cavalry. Not only would they be skilled with the lance, bow, and clubs, but also would be skilled with repeating weapons, whereas the cavalry would still be armed with single-shot Springfields that had the tendency to jam, requiring a tool to clear the block. Soldiers post-Civil War were similar in some ways to pre-war in that they would be mostly immigrants serving, not being so desirable of a profession. The cavalry did have a height and weight requirement, but even so, the Sioux would be traveling extremely light when compared to their cavalry opponents. Custer would organize his cavalry companies by color of horse, which had been the case during the Civil War. You've probably heard about how John Wayne was too big to be a cavalryman. Well, obviously, he does not fit the height and weight requirements that would have been in place. We have mentioned briefly the events that would lead to the 1876 campaign. Remember, we talked about the Colorado War and how there was conflict that was occurring at the time as the war between the states. The U.S. military would be a well-tuned fighting machine, and in many ways the Civil War was not good for the native tribes as it provides the resources and advancement necessary. Sheridan would draw on familiar tactics to strike at native tribes in winter encampments. It's seeming that campaigning against tribes like the Sioux and Cheyenne was almost futile in warmer months. The fact of the matter was that many early histories might gloss over the fact that while Custer was an effective cavalry leader during the Civil War, he was not as well suited to the war that was unfolding in the Great Plains. Like many of his fellow officers prior to the 1876 campaign, though, while there was plenty of combat experience, this was a different type of opponent. Finding the enemy was an issue, especially when faced with their hit-and-run tactics. Frustration would boil over in 1868 when the 7th Cavalry would strike at Black Kettle's camp on the Washita River. This group of peaceful Cheyenne was again looking to turn into the reservation, and most of the warriors were away. If Black Kettle sounds familiar, it was his camp that was hit at Sand Creek. Again, he was betrayed by the U.S. government, for the final time, being killed at the Washita. The estimates for the exact number of casualties would vary, but there were probably 100 or so, mostly women and children, killed during the attack. The Cheyenne would have a score to settle with the Pony Soldiers following the 2 massacres, notably now with the 7th Cavalry. We spoke about this very briefly when we talked about Philip Sheridan in his post-war career, how he has this campaign that he immediately starts to wage on the Plains tribes, and his tactics that he starts to develop are something that he takes from the Civil War and how he's going to start to strike at these encampments while they are in place. And certainly he's pulling off of some of the experiences that he has and some of the other Union cavalry officers have during the war, where they have these kind of deeper strikes into enemy territory. And at least when they know where they are, they certainly can try to find them. And these deeper, longer strikes are going to be risky, but they are also going to be seemingly the most effective way to try to deal with these individuals. In February of 1876, Philip Sheridan would order a joint offensive between George Crook in his department of the Platte and Alfred Terry in his department of the Dakota. Additionally, John Gibbon would be leading a column from Montana in the Yellowstone River region. Crook, of course, had been commanding the Mountain Creepers during Sheridan's Valley campaign, and Terry had served in a variety of commands throughout the war. Gibbon had commanded the famous Iron Brigade and had been the primary recipient of Pickett's charge. To give us a good idea of the routes that the various columns would take, we can think of movements from the west, south, and east. Gibbon would be from the west along the Yellowstone, moving from modern-day Bozeman. Crook would be heading north from Fort Fetterman in southern Wyoming. Terry would be moving from Fort Abraham Lincoln in modern-day Bismarck, North Dakota, heading west from the east. Converging columns would hopefully trap the hostile Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoes, but it would not be easy. This was wild country, so finding them was going to be a problem. Remember that when we talked about Sully and his campaigns, that he has these engagements and they seemingly are kind of small affairs, but the fact that he's even able to find them and force them into any kind of engagement is seen as a W. And so that's kind of the same kind of deal that we're having here. Crook would set out in March, but progress was slow in the winter months. In May, Crook would venture out again, Terry having taken command of Gibbon's column and his own. Crook is going to have elements of the 2nd and 3rd U.S. Cavalry, as well as the 4th and 9th U.S. Infantry. Fortunately, he was joined by Crow and Shoshone allies and scouts. Venturing to a place called Rosebud Creek, Crook would run into Sioux and Cheyenne under Crazy Horse on June 17th. The battle would open with the attacking Sioux attempting to drive the U.S. troops into a valley or draw them into an ambush, both common tactics. Securing his rear, the Crow and Shoshone would do good work in solidifying the initial picket line. Flanking the Sioux, a portion of Crook's command would be broken off and isolated, this section forming a large part of the casualties faced on the day. Eventually, they would break out, Crook having to advance toward the native camp to relieve pressure on the trapped element. He would be convinced to break off any type of pursuit and return to a nearby base. It is hard to know exactly how many casualties were suffered during the battle. The U.S. forces lost somewhere between 14 to 28 dead, and maybe double that wounded, with 15 to 30 native dead, and probably again double that wounded. The important thing is, Crook would be stalled, which is going to be detrimental to the overall campaign. But also, importantly, the Sioux and Cheyenne had met with the Long Knives in the field, and they had seemingly got the better of them, adding to their confidence. The key leader Sitting Bull had prophesied in a vision soldiers falling into their camp, and some in the Lakota and Cheyenne believed it had come true with the Rosebud, but they were not quite right. Just as a quick note and plug here for the Patreon, we actually did They Died with Their Boots On, and obviously that is going to be partly the career of Custer in the Civil War, so definitely a lot more Civil War stuff than you probably would imagine. And then the back half, it's going to be his time on the plains leading up to the Little Bighorn. And one of the things that I point out in that episode is that they mention how essentially every part of these native tribes, they mention a couple of them, are all kind of facing Custer, including the Shoshone. And there is a lot of evidence from some of these accounts that if these guys had not shown up to help Crook, it would have been even worse for his column, even worse for the U.S. military, because they're bearing the initial brunt of this attack. And certainly they're able to, like I said, stabilize the line and then allow for kind of this response from the rest of the infantry and cavalry. So just wanted to point that out, that while they were indeed present, they were not quite on the side of the Sioux and the Cheyenne, not on Crazy Horse's side, as was depicted in that movie. And of course, if you want to hear the rest of my thoughts on that movie and kind of go through some of the other points, certainly, like I said, there are a lot of Civil War points that should be posted, and there is a link to the Patreon in the show description. For the U.S. military, the battle at the Rosebud would narrow down the possible spots for a hostile encampment, especially as a reconnaissance by Major Marcus Reno would show a trail for tent poles that was over 2 weeks old. The plan would be Custer is going to lead his 7th Cavalry south on the Rosebud, while Gibbon and Terry would advance west along the Little Bighorn and Bighorn Rivers. Custer would drive the hostiles into the advancing column, making sure to not allow for any escape further south, as Crook had withdrawn back to Fort Fetterman, following the Rosebud. George Armstrong Custer would lead 566 men on his expedition, declining extra companies of cavalry and Gatling guns offered by Terry because he was confident in his 7th Cavalry's abilities. While you can debate whether the Gatling guns would have been useful, other than being deployed as shock weapons against the Sioux and Cheyenne, one cannot argue that 4 additional companies of cavalry probably would have come in handy at the Little Bighorn. If you are sitting and saying that 566 men is not a whole lot for such an expedition, then you are probably right. Terry even commented that the 7th was not in good shape, and perhaps if Samuel Sturgis, the actual regimental commander, was there, things would have been different. But Sheridan kept him on administrative duty so that his favorite Custer could command in the field. Custer's primary subordinates were Major Marcus Reno, who served in the 1st U.S. Cavalry during the Civil War, part of Wesley Merritt's brigade, Captain Frederick Benteen, who served in Missouri during the war, leading a charge during Price's raid, his brother Thomas Custer, and Captain Miles Keogh, who served on Buford's staff during the Battle of Gettysburg. Tom Custer had been awarded 2 Medals of Honor during the Civil War, so he was no stranger to combat. Lieutenants George Yates and Algernon Smith were both Civil War veterans, as well as capable officers. Yates was a Custer favorite. William Cook served as the regiment adjutant and a capable right-hand man of the famous cavalry leader. Something that should be noted is that Frederick Benteen did despise Custer for his brash action at the Washita, where a good friend of his was abandoned, isolated, and killed during the action, one of the few U.S. casualties. In our narrative, we did read an account of a charge that Benteen was leading, and certainly he would be no stranger to combat, and obviously there are times when you need to be brave, and so I don't think necessarily he would fault Custer for that, but you can also understand as well that there needs to be a calculated amount of risk when it comes to these operations. And that's why I mentioned that these kind of deep forays into enemy territory were already kind of fraught with this sort of risk that you're taking on. So you need to be able to mitigate where you can. So when you already have somebody who's sort of a glory seeker, then it's not going to bode well with somebody who's good at their job and has seen combat, right? But they're not going to see eye to eye with somebody like Custer. The cavalry would travel light and travel quickly into enemy territory, spending 2 nights without sleep. They would march to a wooded ravine for concealment at a place called the Crow's Nest, at the start of the Little Bighorn Valley. Here, Lieutenant Charles Varnum, serving as chief of scouts, would locate the enemy encampment. Bloody Knife, an Arikara scout and favorite of Custer, would provide accurate information. July 26th would be marked as the date for a morning assault on the enemy. From the cavalry's current position, it was said that the camp was spotted, although when Custer was alerted, it was also noted that he could not see the Sioux, and he was using binoculars. Spurred to action, though, he was worried dust from his cavalry had been noticed by warriors, and that the quarry would slip away. Attacking in the middle of the day was questionable, as opposed to waiting until dawn. Custer was given tactical flexibility from Terry, in orders carefully worded to have absolved Terry from any blame should things go wrong. The plan would be Custer would personally retain 5 companies, with 3 attached to Reno and 3 to Benteen. A last company was assigned to the rear of the column behind the pack mules, which meant that it would not be participating in the immediate action, which might not sound like a big deal, but it also means that 142 men are probably not going to be seeing the forthcoming action, at least not immediately. Reno would strike along the Little Bighorn and drive the encampment. Custer, in the meantime, would lead his command along the bluffs and look for a sufficient place to cross and cut off any kind of retreat. It seemed simple enough to George Armstrong, but once again, there would be no eyes on the encampment as of yet. Custer was under the assumption he was facing maybe some 1,000 to 1,500 warriors, when in reality, he was facing most likely 2,000 warriors. A satellite Sans Arc village would be the first target for the oncoming cavalry. Custer had at least learned slightly from the Washita, where he had no real plan, and so Benteen was to detect any additional satellites. But the Sans had fled prior to the cavalry arrival. Notably, it should also be pointed out that many of the Arikara scouts refused to continue as they were aware of the size of the camp. Now, if it was me, and my scouts say, I don't want to go anymore because the camp is pretty big, and presumably they know what they're talking about, right? I think I would maybe rethink my strategy just a little bit, but that might just be me. Reno would start the action by crossing the Little Bighorn and forming to roll up the encampment. In short order, not only was he detected, but also there was a response from the warriors, mostly Lakota in this portion. Scouts in the front commenced firing. Reno initially charged mounted. He realized, though, fairly quickly he was a bit over his head, stopping to dismount and form a skirmish line. On a day where there were a lot of errors by the US military, this definitely made the list. Reno could not afford to give up the initiative like he did in the very opening stage of the action. Had he kept up the charge, even in greater numbers, the warriors would have been on the back foot. The Rosebud had made many of them confident, some overly so, but there was a feeling that the camp was too large to assault, so in some ways Custer was correct in that bold maneuver would be necessary. To the edge of the camp the soldiers got, but the gathering warriors would put a pause to that. We have an account from a trooper in Reno's command. Soon commenced the rattle of rifle fire, and bullets began to whiz about us. I remember that I ducked my head and tried to dodge bullets, which I could hear whizzing through the air. We were soon across the stream, through a strip of timber, and out into the open, where our captain ordered us to dismount and prepare to fight on foot. Our horses were scenting danger before we dismounted, and several at this point became unmanageable and started straight for the open among the Indians, carrying their helpless riders with them. One of the boys, a young fellow named Private Smith of Boston, we never saw again, either dead or alive. There are several accounts of the increased pressure and the sheer amount of firing going on between the sides. Here is Chief Low Dog's account of the fighting. I ordered my men to catch their horses and get out of the way. My men were hurrying to go and help those that were fighting. When the fighters saw that the women and children were safe, they fell back. By this time my people went to help them, and the less able warriors and the women caught horses and got them ready, and we drove the first attacking party back, and that party retreated to a high hill. Then I told my people not to venture too far in pursuit, for fear of falling into an ambush. By this time all the warriors in our camp were mounted and ready for a fight, and then were attacked by the other side by another party. They came on us like a thunderbolt. I never before nor since saw men so brave and fearless as those white warriors. We retreated until our men got all together, and then we charged upon them. I called to my men, "This is a good day to die. Follow me." We massed our men, and that no man should fall back. Every man whipped another man's horse, and we rushed upon them. And we rushed upon the white warriors dismounted to fire, but they did very poor shooting. They had their horses' reins on one arm while they were shooting, but their horses were so frightened that they pulled the men all around, and a great many of their shots went up in the air and did not harm us. The white warriors stood their ground bravely, and none of them made any attempt to get away. After all but 2 of them were killed, I captured 2 of their horses. The situation was quickly devolving, and despite Reno getting a lot of criticism, I think, by all accounts, he was right to start to find a defensive position, giving his much smaller command. His troopers were ordered to mount and dash across the river. 2 Moons gives his account of the fighting. I rode swiftly towards Sitting Bull's camp. There I saw the white soldiers fighting in a line. Indians covered the flat. They began to drive the soldiers all mixed up. Sioux, then soldiers, then more Sioux, all shooting. The air was full of smoke and dust. I saw the soldiers fall back and drop into the riverbed like buffalo fleeing. They had no time to look for a crossing. The Sioux chased them up their hill, where they met more soldiers and wagons. And then messengers came saying more soldiers were going to kill the women, and the Sioux turned back. Chief Gall was there fighting, Crazy Horse also. Custer in the meantime would be riding on the bluffs above the encampment, and finally get a good look at what he was dealing with. We can possibly understand that he too was realizing the size of what he was facing. He would send messengers back, first calling in the company which had been behind the pack mules, and then calling Benteen. The situation that was becoming a problem, though, was that Reno had mentioned he was in trouble. Really, if we think about Custer's overall plan, I've seen in some modern sources an understanding of where he was coming from. He just really does not have enough men to execute, or maybe even the right officers to execute his bold scheme. Reno fails, and Benteen is not going to come to his aid. Spoiler alert, but a determined attack into the Cheyenne camp might have been able to still bring victory. Custer is going to move his troopers down Medicine Tail Coulee, resting the horses midway up the ravine, and sending his trumpeter, Italian-born John Martin, back to find said Benteen to get up with the ammunition. There is controversy over whether Custer utilized all his troopers in this attack, but I have seen in some modern cases where he goes all in this effort, as he does fully understand this flank attack will make or break the day. In battalions, he will assault in waves, first one then the other. I've also seen where he uses a reserve to check his rear. There's also controversy whether Custer leads this charge into the encampment or whether he is watching from a distance. Bobtail Horse and White Shield both were among the warriors who responded to this new threat. There had been a feeling amongst the camp that the attack upriver having been dealt with, the danger was in fact over. Mad Wolf, a dog soldier, was also in the defenders that were being cobbled together. Old men and young boys were using cover along the river as a potential ambush position for the oncoming cavalry. Using repeating rifles, the defenders would pour into the attacking cavalry. The Cheyenne had been victims of Sand Creek and Custer's attack on the Washita, and defense of women and children in the lightly defended camp was powerful motivation to throw everything into the strong showing at the river. Oral tradition has it that the leading officer in this charge was hit in the chest and fell. This was possibly Custer in the attack. Some sources, like the account of Scout White Man Runs Him, place Custer at the river, so this is very plausible. There are several accounts of an officer wearing buckskin being amongst the first being shot, which does not necessarily narrow this down, as many of the Custer clique wore buckskin. However, some historians bicker as to whether Custer was wearing his buckskin during the action at all. Likewise, there is a debate as to what the extent of the casualties at the ford were, and how far the cavalry actually gets into the camp. It is hard to believe that they did not get into the camp at all. A reason for the confusion could be that many of the remains, and unfortunately some who might still have been alive, were dragged into the camp and desecrated by angry women. Some accounts even have some captured troopers being burned at the stake. However, I have also seen some native accounts which deny this. Either way, this makes it confusing when trying to piece together what actually happened. What accounts we do have relay that this was a more prominent attack than older histories claim. At the very least, it is widely believed that Custer was at least wounded. Time was really what the defenders at the fort had taken from the 7th Cavalry, because in the meantime, Crazy Horse and a lot of the Lakota riders were moving toward the support of the Cheyenne and the isolated companies. They would quickly deteriorate the situation, Keogh being killed at some point in this action. Custer's companies had regrouped at some point in this period and tried once again to get into the camp. Facing a determined defense yet again, this command, along with the survivors of Keogh, would retreat to what is known as Last Stand Hill. Hundreds of warriors would overwhelm the dwindling numbers. Reports were that the troopers were trying to fire, but in a panic were still holding to their horses to get away, possibly, and so there would be no accurate fire. We can probably also think that any jamming issues with their Springfield carbines would have been an issue at this point in the battle as well. Tribal legend has it that Buffalo Calf Road Woman strikes the blow that knocks Custer from his horse. His brothers Boston and Tom were both killed as well. Two Moons describes the action from when Custer arrives on the field. I then rode toward my camp and stopped squaws from carrying off lodges. While I was sitting on my horse, I saw flags come over the hill and to the east. Then the soldiers rose all at once, all on horses. They formed into 3 branches, with a little ways between them. Then a bugle sounded, and they all got off horses, and some soldiers led horses back over the hill. The Sioux rode up ridges, on all sides, riding very fast. The Cheyennes went up the left way. Then the shooting was quick, quick. Pop, pop, very fast. Some of the soldiers were down on their knees, some standing. Officers all in front. The smoke was like a great cloud, and everywhere the Sioux went, the dust rose like smoke. We circled all around them, swirling like water around a stone. We shoot, we ride fast, we shoot again. Soldiers drop, and horses fall on them. Soldiers in line drop. But one man rides up and down the line, all the time shouting. He rode a sorrel horse, with white-faced, and white forelegs. I don't know who he was. He was a brave man. Now that account at least kind of gives us a little bit of what we would probably consider to be the classic, movie version of the Little Bighorn, right? Like you kind of get a little bit of that imagery. So I guess it's not necessarily too far off, but at the same time, you can also understand how it's more of a wave, it's more of a panic at Last Stand Hill, as opposed to it being kind of this organized encirclement and we're fighting things out. That's more kind of like the situation that is happening in Reno's command, where he's on a hill and he does have this kind of surrounding going on, and he is able to establish a defensive position, whereas Custer's not necessarily able to do that. And that command is really more still hanging onto their horses. So whether they're trying to act offensively or they're trying to flee, they're still trying to be a mobile command. So you can also understand how a large number of warriors moving around them or kind of moving over them like a wave is going to be detrimental to that movement as well. But where was Benteen? He had been sweeping south and found nothing. Running into perhaps the 2 messengers sent to find him, he moved back and regrouped with Reno and his defensive position on the hill. Fortunately for the troopers, there he also brought ammunition. Reno and Benteen were in a tight spot, Reno having already suffered heavy casualties, but Lieutenant Weir and his command would ride out and possibly get close enough to see from afar the final moments on Last Stand Hill. A delay in action by Godfrey's Company K would save the command as they settled into defensive positions on Reno's hill. The warriors, having finished with Custer and his command, would turn back to Reno and begin to fire on the troopers. They would lay siege to the remnants of the cavalry and then debate what to do. Reno would give an account of this part of the action. The fire did not slacken until about 9:30 a.m., and then we discovered that they were making a last desperate attempt, which was directed against the lines held by companies H and M. In this attack, they charged close enough to use their bows and arrows, and one man, lying dead within our lines, was touched by the coup stick of one of the foremost Indians. When I say the stick was about 10 or 12 feet long, some idea of the desperate and reckless fighting of these people may be understood. With Terry on the way, though, it was deemed prudent to withdraw, and so Reno and Benteen were saved. Casualty numbers are tricky, as they usually are for such engagements, but the native forces probably lost somewhere in the area of 30 to 100, and the cavalry lost 268 killed, 55 wounded, including George Armstrong Custer. A factor that perhaps we often overlooked when we consider why the 7th Cavalry was defeated at the Greasy Grass was the leadership displayed by the various war leaders of the Sioux and Cheyenne, and the situation they were placed. This is not to say that the cavalry does not have their share of capable commanders. Benteen and Reno we both mentioned having seen action in the Civil War, as well as other junior officers, and obviously we have documented the exploits of Custer. But the merit system that placed the war leaders into their positions, combined with their experience, will be solid under normal circumstances, let alone a large numerical advantage, but also we should think about the attack itself. Acting on the defensive against the divided forces of Custer sort of galvanizes these capable leaders toward a common purpose, that of being the defense of the village. There are many besides Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse who deserve their share of the credit for the outcome of the battle, notably for the Lakota, Gull, Crow King, Rain in the Face, Kicking Bear, Flying Hawk, Burl, Two Kettles, amongst others. Of the Northern Cheyenne, we have Two Moons, Wooden Leg, Old Bear, Lame White Man, Bobtail Horse, White Shield, Mad Wolf, and Black Hawk. Archaeological evidence does seem to confirm that the warriors were probably better armed than the cavalry. They had plenty of repeating weapons and were trained to use them. That is not to say that arrows were not used, but there are some arguments I've seen that overplay, I think, the use of arrows during the battle. Superior numbers and arms is already a pretty hard road to climb, but also there are some tactical blunders we can point to on the part of George Armstrong Custer. He attacks in the heat of the day, not waiting until his command is rested, the area fully scouted, and he relies on officers who are going to let him down. In terms of our narrative episodes, this is really a far cry from the situations we are used to, even if we can say Custer might not deserve the credit he gets at East Cavalry Field. This event struck the nation, though, like a thunderbolt. Immediately, the romanticism of Custer and his last stand would start to unfold. I mentioned how we have these images from films of cavalry in a circle going down in a blaze of glory, and in some ways, this is part of the fallout. The significance of the Battle of the Greasy Grass, or Little Bighorn, is important for the Lakota, I believe, going beyond just the concluding story of George Armstrong Custer. This victory is culturally significant even today. I do not necessarily want to downplay Custer, and it is important to conclude his story, but I do think that at least this portion of his tale is part of a grander one. At this stage, you will see Philip Sheridan and his encouraging of the elimination of the buffalo herds. This was a key victory, and maybe one of the last victories of the Sioux would be able to look at in a long road to subjugation at the hands of the US government. Crook and Terry again would campaign, and the Sioux would never again have numerical superiority. The Sioux Wars would effectively be over by 1877. Crazy Horse would turn to the reservation and soon be killed due to a failed translation, perhaps on purpose, in 1877. Sitting Bull would flee to Canada, and eventually he too would be killed by native police on the agency. There is a string of poor treatment, whether it is on these reservations, leading to the massacre at Wounded Knee, which was executed by the 7th Cavalry. While the road is pretty well covered with inequality and tragedy when it comes to the Plains tribes at the hand of the government, there is a very large victory that still looms. The flip side of that, though, is probably spurred more into action on the part of the government toward their end. I've heard in some sources that this was a war that could not be won, the end inevitable, and you can really see exactly why. Even with this victory, we do still have the conclusion that we get. So we'll go ahead and stop right there for the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Hopefully we have a better understanding, a revisited understanding of this engagement, and we've closed the book on the conclusion of George Armstrong Custer. Join us next time as we return to our high-level overview as we do the year 1862. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.